Okay, so my presentation is titled Defending the Indefensible, and what I kind of want to do with it is kind of talk about how terrorists are treated by the U.S. legal system, kind of trying to answer the question of whether or not they're treated fairly, or I guess with all the problems in the criminal justice, as fairly as anybody else is treated. So the first kind of challenge that I had was that it's hard to find like high profile terrorist cases where there'll be a lot of information on it where the terrorist didn't die, because a lot of terrorist attacks, if there are not outright suicide attacks, they'll often end with a confrontation with the police, a deadly confrontation with the police or something similar. And so I was, when I first started this project, I was going through a list of terrorists, and I thought about, well, this guy, no, they died. This person, no, they died, and just going through. And it was really hard to come up with relevant cases until I discovered this place, ADX Florence. That is the facility. This is ADX Florence. And so that's kind of the first piece of the puzzle, I guess you could say. ADX Florence is an ultra-high security prison known as a Supermax in Florence, Colorado, and it's reserved for the most dangerous offenders in the United States. So a lot of people who are there you have cartel leaders, spies, organized crime leaders who might try to communicate with their organizations and still run them while they're in jail. I found one person there who is a serial child molester who might be in danger from other inmates if they find out what he did. And then there are people there who are dangerous to other inmates or guards or prison staff. And a lot of terrorists end up there as well. So this is just kind of a short list of terrorists who have ended up in ADX Florence. So you have Ramzi Youssef, who is one of the main perpetrators of the '93 World Trade Center bombing, the shoe bomber, one of the Boston bombers, the Unabomber, who I was very surprised to find out he's still alive. Terry Nichols, co-conspirator of Timothy McVeigh, this guy who was the attempted Times Square bomber. So these are a lot of really high-profile terrorists that have ended up in Florence. And it's not a pleasant place. It's basically complete isolation for 20 to 24 hours a day. The cell windows only look out to the sky. The inmates don't know where they are in relation to other prisoners. This makes it harder to plan escapes. And there's basically no communication with the outside world and no socialization with other prisoners. And so this is probably a good example of how terrorists are treated in the United States. And one of the relevant details with Florence is this case, Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. While it's not directly related to terrorism, it is, I think, a good example of how they're treated. So it was a class action lawsuit on behalf of all prisoners in this place. And it argues that the Bureau of Prisons' treatment of these people was, especially the mentally ill people, was unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And, looking at it, they might have a point. So this picture is, this is the social hall at ADX Florence. So these are cages, if it's hard to see, and the prisoners who are allowed to socialize with other prisoners, they go one at a time into these cages, and that's how they talk. That's how they're allowed to socialize with each other. One person in each cage, and that's your social. So that's a party. That's a prison party. And interestingly enough, the prisoners won the case. A federal judge ruled that their treatment was unconstitutional, and there are reforms and settlements currently underway by the Bureau of Prisons. So kind of the question that brings to my mind, there are two ways that this could be interpreted. So there's kind of one strand of thought that I follow that says, well, if a judge was willing to hear a case on behalf of these prisoners, and not only hear it, but rule in favor of these prisoners, some pretty awful people, that should show that, yeah, they're probably treated fairly, they have access to the justice system, and it sounds like they're given a fair shake in the courts. The other track that can be taken with that is that, so this case was, Florence has been open since the 70s or 80s, and this case was just settled in 2015. So the other track kind of says, well, if we were willing to send these people to this pretty awful place and not really litigate it for 30 years, then that is evidence that they're not treated that fairly, that they're, we don't consider their human rights to be that important. So that's kind of one part of my research. The other part is kind of this case study. These are the two people whose legal defense I've studied in detail at all. The first one is Timothy McVeigh. He carried out the Oklahoma City bombing, and the second is Ramzi Youssef, who carried out the first World Trade Center bombing. I chose these two because their methods were pretty similar. They both used a truck bomb. They both attacked prominent buildings. Their death tolls were pretty disparate. McVeigh killed 168 people, while only 6 people died in the original World Trade Center building. But what most interests me is that their motivations are extremely different. So McVeigh was kind of this radical, far-right, anti-government protester. He wanted revenge for the Waco siege with the Branch Davidians. And Youssef is, an Islamic terrorist. And so I thought there might be some interesting differences in their legal defenses I thought there would be some interesting differences in how they were treated by the justice system because of, their different motivations, the fact that one's white, the other's not white. But it was interesting to me that they weren't all that different. So they're both represented by public defenders. That's not surprising because they probably don't have enough money and not that many people willing to represent them. But something that really interested me was that they both claimed discrimination in appeals. They both said that they had been treated unfairly and discriminated against by the government. Youssef, because he was brown and Muslim. I didn't really understand why McVeigh tried to claim discrimination, but he did. So they both tried to claim that as a mitigating factor. And their outcomes were obviously very different as well. McVeigh was executed and Youssef was sentenced to life imprisonment, which he's been spending in ADX Florence. So not much better than execution, I'd say. Yeah. That's what I have. Any questions? Yeah.
Are you just limiting to ADX Florence, or you're going to look at Guantanamo Bay as well?
I'm not going to look at Guantanamo because it's kind of outside the traditional court system. It's a military prison. And the people there are not technically, they are enemy combatants according to the U.S., to the military. So they're not treated in kind of the traditional legal sense. Any other questions?